low noise information brief brought to you by a biologist. You are here if you've been here for a while, and if not, we're going to help you stay focused on the biology. Don't take bait on social media and love your neighbor. That's the idea. The way this works, unfortunately, is because a few people have decided to give me money every month. I am not a serial entrepreneur that invented the optical mouse. I am a humble, recovering academician. I was trying to get on the tenure track at a university for about 15 years and stutter-stepped my way through the academy until they threw me out at the beginning of the pandemic, and now I am recovering. My recovery from being an academician has been greatly accelerated by a guy by the name of Greg Glassman, and thanks for that YouTube update. Greg Glassman and Emily Kaplan of the Broken Science Initiative. This month we're going to start working on some of those themes as well. And we're going to start looking at Matt Briggs and his small collection of tutorials on understanding Bayesian probability, understanding why Popperian falsification of null hypotheses is silly. Illusion is sustained only through your active participation. What that means is you got to put your phone down, you got to get off of social media, Gab, Telegram, Twitter, Facebook. All of this stuff is nonsense. You've got to start choosing people to listen to, people that are doing the work that's required and trying to give you something of value in return. You've got to stop tuning into these things that are funded by coffee and energy drinks and people that are selling Squarespace or this kind of thing. You just got to get off of all of these. These are fake sources of information. That's what they are. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Gigaohm Biological. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. It's 10:44 in the morning in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm coming to you live from my garage. This is Gigaohm Biological. It's May 6th, 2024. We have another high resistance, low noise information brief for you this morning. Intramuscular injection of any combination of substances with the intent of augmenting the immune system is dumb. Transfection in healthy humans is criminally negligent, and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of academic biologists and doctors around the United States and the world should have known better, because they should have known the definition of the word, and they should have known enough about the immune system in order to object to using it on healthy humans. But they didn't, and they owe you and all of the young people in the world an apology. You can find my apology at gigaohmbiological.com/Scooby. RNA cannot pandemic is a way of provoking your supposedly biologically savvy friends and family members to start thinking again about what really happened and what couldn't have happened. If you haven't joined us before, or you haven't been here in a while, our hypothesis hasn't changed in a while. The WHO declared a pandemic of a particularly novel virus, but it wasn't novel. We don't even know if there was a circulating pathogen, because there isn't really any epidemiological evidence for that. However, there is a great deal, a mountain of evidence that supports the idea of a series of bad ideas and really bad incentives enforcing those bad ideas was used in a national security sort of way to convince the world that a pandemic did indeed occur. Involved in this illusion was, of course, non-specific PCR tests, but also legal and financial incentives that made it very hard for people not to go along with the narrative. It is possible that an RNA infectious clone was used in order to seed the molecular data, which has been misconstrued as a pandemic. But since 1 or 100 RNA molecules in a mud puddle no matter what they have as far as fear and cleavage sites or other magic inserts, that sequence could not by itself, like a pattern integrity, cover the world in a matter of months, never mind in a matter of several different variants and whatever that they've said has happened up until now. And the reason why they've told us this elaborate story and insist on this illusion of consensus about it is because we are in the midst of a very slow roll of our sovereignty and the very way that we think about our freedom is being changed. And fundamentally, we are going to have our system reorganized from a national sovereignty and citizens-oriented thing to a more global collective thing where citizens need permission to exist.
What I want is high morbidity.
The way that this was done.
Complain. So what do? I go to Des Moines. Ladies and gentlemen and people on the screen, I have nothing against Des Moines. I lived there for 4 years. I go to Des Moines. I infect a couple of sentinel cases in Des Moines. I go to Seattle. I infect a couple of cases there. I go to North Carolina. I go to Wisconsin. What I'm doing is I'm using a dispersion methodology to be able to infect sentinel cases with a highly morbid condition. These individuals complain. Again, this is a central nervous system condition. So they're complaining of whatever the bug may do. It'll produce some cascade of neurological and neuropsychiatric signs and symptoms. And then what I do, the real bug that I use is the internet. I take attribution for that. Yes, I'm a terrorist group. And I have done this by infecting with a highly lethal agent, and the first signs and symptoms of lethality are X, Y, and Z. These people are really sick with this. But then I say, others who are also infected will show subdromal, predromal signs of lethality, and what that will be is anxiety, sleeplessness, agitation. What I've now done is I've got every individual who is diagnostically hypochondriacal.
Now, the thing that I've been trying to explain on the stream for the last couple years now, and it is a couple years now that I've gotten almost to the finish line on this. And I think over the last 3 or 4 months, we've just been rocking. And over the last few weeks, working on prions and amyloidosis and following up on the very basic biology of what we know and don't know about these phenomenon has revealed something about this big picture, which is really shocking. And that is that when Dr. Giordano says the real bug that I use is the internet, he's not specific enough. But I think over the last couple weeks, after circling a lot of these things for a long time, Epigirl, the phenomenon of Epigirl inside of the SPARS pandemic document, is the phenomenon that you see here on the screen. The idea is when you use the internet, you're not spreading rumors. You're not sending out emails that other people share with other people. Oh, look, there's a leak. Oh, look. No. It's much more complicated than that. 5th generation warfare is spreading liars. Spreading coordinated liars that can each be their own stage in this Lollapalooza. And so, as I said in the beginning, if you don't like the Christian nationalist stage with Steve Kirsch and Robert Malone, 2 longtime Democratic National Committee, Democrats, blue, are pretending now to be red. If you don't like that on that stage, you can go over here and you can watch, I don't know who else. I don't want to make up any names but you see what I'm saying. You can watch, I can look on there. You can watch No Virus People. And you can find Andy Kaufman and Tom Cowan talking about, I don't know what, electromagnetics and how public health is a sham or something like that. Maybe they say that vaccines are bad. I don't know. But because that stage of Lollapalooza is asking some really bad questions too, because this stage of Lollapalooza is making some obviously stupid assumptions, and because those people over there are still basically along with the idea of a novel virus and a virus that can be created in a laboratory and go around the world, and on the idea that it could be asymptomatic too. Maybe it's only certain races that it's asymptomatic for. That's how you can see that actually the people in the middle here, Michael Yeadon and Sukrit Bhakti and Nick Hudson and Wolfgang Wodak and myself, we've been completely silenced because we don't buy into any of these major stage narratives of there is no virus and there is no ion channels and there are no, the heart isn't a pump or something like that. I heard somebody say, or read somebody said in the chat. And we don't go along with some of these more worst case scenario type narratives where 1 billion people could die next time if there's 2 furin cleavage sites. And yet the narrative that's being amplified on YouTube right now, the number of videos that you can find of supposedly censored Robert Malone, it's absurd. And so the only conclusion I can come to is that we have progressed far enough now where some of these people are on stage now and they're not pretending not to be on stage. Now they're angry because people that aren't on stage are saying that they're not part of the show, that they're not a legitimate part of the show, but they are. They are a very legitimate part of the show. They have always been a very legitimate part of the show. That's the point. When they identify or they say that, oh, I'm being accused of being a controlled op, no. It's not a controlled operation. The whole thing is a controlled operation. There are only a few people who are not a part of the controlled operation. I'm not saying that Robert Malone is a controlled op. I'm saying Robert Malone is part of a controlled op, the same controlled op that Sasha Latipova is involved in. And in fact, I think that that's what is going to save our children right now, because they are overextending past their skis. They are tumbling down the hill right now, still claiming to be world-class skiers. And all we need to do is compare their words. They're on stage. There's video of it. And so if what they're saying now doesn't jive with what they said then, if what they're claiming they did back then is not what they actually did back then we can come to no other conclusion that they're part of this controlled operation. And I really don't like to be where I am right now, where I have to constantly remind everybody that, hey, don't forget that I've seen these aliens in person. But I have. It's one of the reasons why I feel called to do this, because not many people have this much evidence from real life to edify their courage. Some people have been a lot more courageous having had no physical and personal contact with any of these people, having not been meddled with over 4 years like I've been meddled with. And that meddling has now resulted in me having such a conviction about the alignment of these people, such a conviction about who must be motivating them, that I feel it's okay to put my whole family's future on the line. I'm not afraid. Because it is actually, as Mark Twain said, it's very easy when you only tell the truth. You don't have to remember anything. And the things that you forget, you can just read again. Or you can rewatch the video. And that's the advantage we have. We don't have to remember what we said in 2020 like Robert Malone does. We don't have to remember what they wrote in that article about Jesse Gelsinger because Robert Malone does. We can just read it again. We're not the ones who are standing on stories. We're not the ones who have edified our existence based on a mythology that reinforces all these other mythologies. We're not part of the Lollapalooza. We are part of the people that are complaining that we did not, this show is not what we know. No. And it's this show, this whole show. You can't think of it as anything else other than a show. And very, very few people in this show who are actually doing what we thought they were, which was, I guess, fighting for our grandkids. No. This is an active governance play. This is the public-facing theater group of a weaponized money cartel. Hey, so today we're going to watch Nick Hudson on Russell Brand in 2024. This was this week. It's a pretty good interview. It's going to allow me to relax a little bit and reorient. I'm going to take some notes and see what Nick said. And there's a few things, of course, that Nick says really well, and I hope he gets them right on Russell's show. I listened to it up to the point where he talked about New York and mentioned Jessica Hockett. And I was really pleased with what I heard. And then I moved on. So I hope that this is also useful for you to see. I think I have it queued up here. You're going to the wrong screen, though, you bonehead. It's supposed to go. Oh, yeah, I unplugged that. That's right. This is supposed to go over here. Should go here. Ooh, what's happening? I think I might have to start that over. I unplugged a monitor, and so it's getting a little mad, but I think it'll be fine now. Or not. What's happening here? Open. A little grinding going on. We'll see what's happening here. I might have to do a little Control-Alt stuff here. Task Manager. Don't crash on me, man. Where are you? What's happening? Background processes. What's happening? Why are you not running? There it is. End task. There we go. That should probably help me. Will that work now? Yes. Okay, so I'm gonna probably set it up to go a little faster because, you know, it's always better that way. Maybe 1.3. Thanks very much for joining me, guys. Thank you very much. Let's go right away to the beginning of this, obviously.
In this video, you're going to see the... Hello there, you Awakening Wonders. Thanks for joining me today for Stay Free with Russell Brand. And indeed, it is an extraordinary episode if you're interested in freedom. There's not many people in the COVID pandemic space that are willing to draw extraordinary conclusions based on arithmetic and understanding of the type of modeling that was deployed and how that in itself was utilized to propagandize an entire planet into terror. Nick Hudson is such a man. He has a unique insight into the way that the media, the state, and the pharmaceutical industry, of course, benefited from presenting information in a particular way. But I've got so many questions. Like, what about people that were on the ground? What about the good, honest key workers and health professionals that were on the ground experiencing the pandemics and the intensive care units full of people on ventilators in dread? What about those people that are reporting how various medications and lockdown measures saved their lives? Well, there's so much to cover, and we'll be covering it all. Of course, we can't cover it on YouTube because of, curiously enough, the kind of censorship that became normalized during the pandemic period and is increasingly being used to shut down dissent on a variety of topics, whether it's war, whether it's pandemics, whether it's climate change, you name it. There's censorship on it. Indeed, what we are experiencing now is a war against dissent, and we have to win that war through dissent. So even by participating in this conversation right now, you are participating in the revolution. But why not dig a little deeper? Why not become an awakened wonder? Join our community every single week. We do an exclusive video. This week's one is a beautiful dive into fluoride. And is it conspiracy theory or conspiracy fact? You get to join us live for conversations and put your content in.
I'm going to end the YouTube stream right now just to kind of consolidate everybody. But I do like putting the YouTube thing up, and I'm going to keep doing it. And so... you know, because we can rope new people in from YouTube. So if you're at YouTube There's lots of places you can go. You can go to Rumble, you can go to PeerTuber, you can go to Twitch. I'm sorry, but YouTube is, it's definitely not the place where we want you to spend your time. So thanks for coming, and I'll see you. Say that.
My first moment of shock awakening was...
Did you hear that? What were the Stations of the Cross? I don't know if you're not a Catholic, I don't know if that's even a thing in Protestants and other. I'm a Catholic, so at least I was raised Catholic, so I understand the reference as a Catholic reference to the Stations of the Cross, which is, it's just I don't think Nick appreciates that either necessarily. Maybe he's not even a believer or anything like that, so it doesn't bother him. But I find that just a weird. I mean, would you say that about someone else? Make another religious thing like that? Would you make that about Muhammad, or you know what I mean? Like, you wouldn't do that. So why would you do it about Christ? I don't understand that. Other than, I think there's some game being played there by Russell, and that's what bothers me about Russell. If you want to know, he's done some kind of thing where he says a rosary on Rumble as part of his locals thing or something. I don't know. I don't know much, but I do know that the public display of faith is not something that, it doesn't seem like, anyway, the stuff that I've read, that's something that Jesus Christ was big on. He wanted you to have a personal relationship with God the Father, and I think he wanted you to do it in private. And so a lot of, modern American Christianity, especially in these big mega churches that I have personal experience with, also feel to me like something gone awry. And so it is with great trepidation that I ever bring up faith on this show, because I don't want people to be confused by the fact that, I don't want people to be confused and think about that as a serious issue with regard to talking about the mythology that these pseudobiologists have created over the last 30 years. And I think as far as rescuing our children goes, the more that we can keep that as objective as possible, so that, again, we don't burn down the Library of Alexandria because there are a few shitty books in it. And instead, we empower our children to go into that library and clean it out. And in so doing, I think we have to empower our children with some sense of spirituality. And I don't necessarily think that for all people and in all situations, that means we first all have to convert to Christianity. And I'm not going to be, I don't consider myself that person. I consider, I feel as though it is my using my faculties the best if I try to be the tutor, the biology tutor that gets people to understand that there is a great deal that we don't understand, and that's the most beautiful part of biology. And when you start to see that for what it is, it starts to become impossible not to appreciate it as evidence of creation and evidence of the divine, and it is spiritual energy that almost compels you to have a reverence for something that without it, I think humans are unmoored. I think kids are unmoored if they don't have a reverence for the world that they're in. And so if you don't show people the beauty that surrounds them and they aren't able to see it, then they won't be waking up in the morning every day with a reverence for what's around them. And I, for whatever reason, mostly I think because of my grandmother, I really think that very early on I was instilled with this idea that when I looked outside, I saw beauty. I saw fascinating things. I saw an immense amount of complexity of which I was a integral part of it. And so I do really think it's important that when that thing happens, especially with Russell Brand that I say something, but I also want to be very clear that this stream is one guy, and I'm not going to lie about who I am. I'm not going to try and disguise who I am. I'm a little kid in a 52-year-old man's body with children I definitely that are way better than the amount of time that and energy that I've put into them, and I'm blessed to have a best friend that has stuck with me from the very beginning. And occasionally you're going to hear the Catholic in me, the altar boy in me. You're going to hear the man that prays in me. And I hope that just lends credence to the fact that this is a genuine person and not a sponsored voice, not a state actor, not a controlled op, but someone who has paid the very heavy price of actually seeing the alien and actually being lied to and manipulated by the people who I now am trying to point out very clearly because of my personal experience, because I can say these things and they can't come back after me. I can tell you what Meryl Nass said to my face and she can't sue me for that. I can tell you what Robert Malone said to my face and he can't sue me for that. I can show you what Robert Malone said on a video in 2020 and he can't sue me for that. And I can show how those videos contradict one another, and therefore what he says now in 2024 effectively has to be a lie. Or what he said in 2020 was a lie, and then that would be that he lied during the worst part of the pandemic. So either way, it's kind of like, whoa, wait, what? And so it's just a question of when do we do this? How do we do this? Who's going to do it? When? Because all the material's there. It's already on my hard drive. It's already in a slide deck. I just don't know really when is the right time to try and accomplish this, because it's a giant thing. If we now suddenly stand up at Lollapalooza during a break and say all of these bands suck, all of these bands are fake, all of these bands are just Juilliard musicians that have decided to play punk rock for the afternoon, and they're all getting bank from it, and they're all lying to you. And Nick Hudson, I think it's very possible that he is not part of this show. I think they tried to co-opt him. They invited him or asked him to join them on a cruise off the coast of Turkey in 2022. And so he spent a week interacting with these people and having a week of personal acting, you know, like people behaving in a way to try and co-opt Nick. I don't even know if he's even aware of it. But I'm sure that's what happens at these events, because I've been to these events where a lot of these people show up and they have contact with you and they mention the other one, or they whisper about the other one, or there's some rumor. And then it seems like, wow, you're really involved in intrigue. And then those people over by the window have put chairs together and they're talking about something serious. Wow, cool. I wish I was a part of that group. And so if you invite someone like Nick onto a boat like that and court him with random discussions about wine and interacting with your wife in front of him and telling him personal stories about your kid, then it's very easy at the end of the trip to say, hey, maybe you should join us here and talk about this there and do whatever. Nick Hudson was at that meeting in Romania. Nick Hudson was at that meeting with the people in Romania. He's in this picture right here. Oops. Let me just escape and do that again. Nick Hudson is right there. But when Robert Malone and when Meryl Nass and when Jessica Rose and when Harvey Reich and when Brett Weinstein came back from Romania, they all said, wow, I saw a great presentation. And it was Denny Rancourt, this Canadian guy, and he showed us that maybe 17 million people have been killed by the the shots around the world. Wow, impressive. So you didn't hear the talk by Nick Hudson where he said that there was no pandemic and it's a big lie? You didn't see the data that Denny Rancourt presented that corroborated and edified the conclusions that Nick Hudson had presented? Really? Is that possible? And unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm in the position to know firsthand that these people have to be liars. Because I've been talking to them for 4 years and their stories are weird. That timeline is weird. And only certain members of this story have had very consistent behavior. Mark Kulak has had very consistent behavior. Actually, if you want to hear crazy, Bobby Kennedy has had pretty consistent behavior with me. Other people in that circle of CHD have not, but Bobby has. I'm not saying that I'm going to vote for him for president or I think his stance on anything is necessarily good. I'm just saying that for his interactions with me, I got nothing to say. He put me very prominently on a list in front of his book, and I've been able to use it to some degree, you know, to say, look, I'm somebody. I'm not nobody. But unfortunately, they would like me to be nobody because I'm starting to teach enough biology to people like Nick Hudson where you're going to actually hear it for this whole hour, and he's never going to say my name, which is totally fine because he uses my words and he gets the concepts out there, which is great. But he doesn't say infectious clones or RNA virology because it's not his expertise, but he's very good at saying what he says. So wow, I really am still going bananas again here. Sorry, I'm being a dork. Let's start that again.
So right at the beginning. By qualification, I'm an actuary, so I sort of have an easy way around data and was looking for some signs of what this whole COVID story was about. And it was very obvious very early on that the risk was being dramatically exaggerated, if there was even one at all. And I could see there was just tons of propaganda floating around. And those two pieces together with my inability to find many people in my network that I thought was pretty solid, who I could even speak to about this problem, those things woke me up to the dawning of a real problem in the world. And over the next few years, it just went from bad to worse.
Before we continue,
Holy shit.
do you have trouble sleeping or staying asleep? Perhaps because you're a busy parent.
My God, that was loud. I'm so sorry, guys.
Get back into it.
Oh, man.
I've gone, the full yard on this whole story. Our organization doesn't believe that there was a pandemic. The whole thing's been a fake. We don't believe that there was a novel pathogen spreading from a point source. We think that the harms that there were, and there were indeed harms, were largely caused by the reaction to the purported viral outbreak. Harms from bad treatment protocols, harms from fear and panic, harms from inappropriate use of medicines, inappropriate testing with PCR, crazy time.
I mean, I think that Russell Brand is one of these people who has a certain shtick that to the people who like it, it is incredibly attractive and enticing and warm. And I don't have the same feeling, and I don't know. I don't want to make comments, that Russell's a good guy or a bad guy. I don't connect with Russell, and so a lot of his energy is not coming off the screen for me. So it's fine, but I do understand why a lot of people do follow him, and it's not just because he is artificially elevated on all these platforms, but it also is because he has an incredible skill as an orator, and he's not bad. I mean, if he was really on our team, he would be a very, very big, a very important ally. I don't think that he is, and I don't think that's a bad thing to say. I don't think that he's on our team, and that he just plays for these weaponized piles of money. I'm sure he does.
Lines of approval, et cetera, et cetera. So we've basically reached the point after years and years of careful study where we say that the entire pandemic was a fraud.
That's an extraordinary conclusion to have reached, although when you announced that fear was a component in creating the conditions. Even the legacy media reported, I noted this week, that perhaps one of the reasons there's been a radical increase in cardiac arrest in recent years might be because of an increase in anger. There are a spate of stories suggesting that might be the cause for the extraordinary increase in heart conditions that have been observed in the last few years. If I can pick up on one of the early points in your last response, the fact that you're an actuary, I know what that word means, that it means that you have a good understanding of mathematical data. So what in particular about the mathematical data sets in the early part of the pandemic has led you to what to many people will be the astonishing conclusion that there was not a pandemic? What particularly in the mathematical data?
Well, it was really clear that there was no risk presented to even vaguely healthy people under the age of 70. So to call a disease that it maybe presents a threat to people with many other comorbidities and among the elderly people, most of whom are in old age homes or in ICUs at hospitals, to call a disease of that nature a pandemic, that's a fraud. Then some months later in 2020.
I mean, be clear, if I was to go on Russell Brand, I would have notes at least about the points that I didn't want to forget. Maybe I wouldn't need notes. I don't know, but I don't think it's bad to have notes. And if somebody has notes and I'm very good at not having notes, well, then that's just because I've done it every day for so long now that I'm a nutcase. And maybe Nick is just starting.
We began to get the first kind of granular data. So that would be, information at a very detailed geographic location. And when we looked at that data from the UK, from Italy, from the United States, what we couldn't see was the telltale signs of pathogenic spread. Those are called cluster and ripple effects. And we could not detect those in data from anywhere on the planet. So this whole story that there was a novel deadly virus spreading and causing harm amongst the general population that everybody needed to hide under their beds was false.
So interesting then, right, to think that this meeting in Romania occurred and that Jessica Rose and Brett Weinstein and Robert Malone and Meryl Nass and Stephen Hatfill and Harvey Reich and all these people came back after seeing Denny Rancourt's data and Nick Hudson's data, which showed that there's no evidence of spread, and decided to completely ignore that Nick Hudson was there and to only promote the data from Denny Rancourt that showed that there were people killed by the shot, not to promote the data that showed that the death in the United States was correlated to counties by poverty level and by household income and serious mental illness and obesity, and not correlated with spread. And whether or not the vaccines were taken up didn't change anything in his analysis. So all of this data was available to them. And they, again, remember, not only Denny Rancourt's data about the potential dangers of the shot and how they've increased all-cause mortality, but also how all-cause mortality was probably caused by other things other than a spreading novel pathogen. A lot of these people actually also know who John Bodwin is, and John Bodwin also doesn't have evidence from any of the databases that he's looked at to show that there was a novel risk additive spreading pathogen. But none of the people that support John Bodwin seem to be convinced that that's part of a message that needs to get out. And so at least since November 23, when they finally invited these guys to a meeting, they invited them to a meeting in Bucharest, Romania, and then they didn't invite them as part of a new team. They invited them as part of a team of people that had already been in Europe several times together. Jessica Rose, Meryl Nass, Robert Malone, Brett Weinstein, and Harvey Reich. And so the idea that Steve Hatfill is standing in the middle of this picture with that look on his face, that there's Ryan Cole right there. I mean, come on, ladies and gentlemen. Why do the same 4 or 5 Americans show up in all of these foreign countries? And why is it that those same 4 or 5 Americans then step in front of a lot of these people who say that there's no pandemic after they meet them? And how come we don't see this consistent pattern where the word gets out, but it doesn't really get out? Like, let's invite Denny Rancourt to Romania instead of Washington, D.C., right? Because Romania is closer or something. What? Let's invite Nick Hudson to Romania instead of inviting him to the Senate. And instead, when we go to the Senate, why don't we just have Robert Malone compose the guest list, and then we'll bring some people from Romania. I mean, I'm not some kind of, analyst. I'm a biologist. But I know when people are lying to me. I know when people are lying to me.
That was that.
It's interesting when when some of the ideas that emerge that not necessarily contradict each other, but may not complement each other as neatly as I would like. For example, when people say that, and there is some evidence to suggest that that what was taking place in the Wuhan Institute of Virology was dual-purpose research, that the Eco Health Alliance patented a particular pathogen that was likely, at least there's some evidence to suggest, was related to the outbreak of COVID-19, identifiable by its somewhat unique cleavage site. When we say that there was not they're saying, okay, this outbreak of COVID-19, identifiable by its somewhat unique cleavage site. When we say that there was not a
Did he mentioned the cleavage site? I mean, imagine that we're still here 4 years later, where today or yesterday on here, hopefully that won't automatically start so that I can just show it. Darn, it didn't do that. Autoplay is off, so if I refresh it, it shouldn't autoplay. Why is it autoplaying? But anyway, Emily Kopp was again on Rising, and she's going to talk about how, new lab leak details have surfaced, and in 2024, we're still playing Scooby-Doo, and we could have been there already in 2020. But that wasn't the idea. The idea is to tell a story over many years, over which time a series of transitions is going to occur financially and socioeconomically, and you're going to be distracted by these things, this mythology in the background. It's in the background for them. It's not in the background for us. They put it right in the front, right? That was the idea. But for them, it's in the background. They have other plans that extended far beyond this. This was just the opening party. Otherwise, how do you explain that we're here in 2024 and no one seems to care about what people said and did in 2020 and 21 anymore? The only reason why we're there is because people want it that way. Russell Brand doesn't have someone on, we don't ever have anybody interview Robert Malone and have him explain what he was doing in 2020 again. Where were you in 2019, Robert Malone? What were you doing in 2019 that made it possible for Mike Callahan to call you in 2020 and tell you to spin up your team? And then you spun up a team of volunteers that got together a computer-generated model of an X-ray crystallography measurement of a computer-generated model of X-ray crystallography of a viral protein, and then scanned all known pharmaceuticals in the FDA database for ones that would work, and you identified remdesivir, celecoxib, ivermectin, and famotidine with your friend, I guess David Hone and a few other people. Rick A is one name, I guess, he worked with. I don't know. And so there was no stop this. There was no, hey, a long time ago I lost my career because I spoke out about adenovirus as not being a good way of augmenting a sick, genetically deficient human. And so maybe we shouldn't use adenovirus encoding a viral spike protein on healthy humans in the UK. Did he speak out about that? But he tells you the story that he lost his whole career based on the idea that he spoke out about Jesse Gelsinger's death 3 times in a New York Times article, making the career of some girl. But he lost his career and had to start or head up a breast cancer institute in Maryland. That's the consolation prize for Robert Malone, throwing away his career to speak out about the bioethic, going off protocol of Jesse Gelsinger. But he didn't have the principles in 2020 or 2020, yes, to tell people in the UK that maybe it's not such a good idea to use adenovirus with a spike protein that has, we didn't even check if it's got any overlapping sequences or sequences that could be a problem. We're just going to do it. That would be nuts. There was a virologist in Norway who felt it was necessary to speak out like that, but it wasn't Robert Malone. Robert Malone was working with Ditra to get repurposed drugs out there and combinations of repurposed drugs that could be patentable. Because that's what he does. He's a consultant on how to make money. And yet now we're supposed to believe that he's been on a white horse from the very beginning, and he just dropped his emu eggs and whistled and rode a horse into Washington, D.C. and blew the whistle. But that's not what happened at all, and that's not what's happening now. Him and Steve Kirsch on the Vaccine Safety Research Foundation meetings every Thursday asking for monthly donations, that's not real. That's one of the stages in this Lollapalooza. And even when a guy like Nick Hudson seems to get on stage in Lollapalooza, you will see it's not going to go anywhere. It's not going to change the way Russell Brand talks about gain-of-function viruses and talks about lab leaks, because no biology will be discussed in this, and that's what makes Nick Hudson still kind of a safe guest. Not a bad guest, just a safer guest than me.
And they're saying, okay, this thing was created in a lab, it's a bioweapon, and you're saying that because there was no cluster and ripple effect, which is a sort of a requirement in a pandemic for it to even warrant the use of that term. Do you see that there's a sort of a contradiction there? They're saying it was a man-made in a virus, it's a man-made in a lab, and you're saying that actually, in a sense, from the beginning, it should never have been described as a pandemic. From the very offset, what we should have been told is there's a pathogen that appears to, if you have respiratory conditions or comorbidity.
He's still trying to do it. What we should have been told is that there's a pathogen that if you have comorbidities, so he's still defending the virus, he's still defending the faith, right? That's the same faith. Hear it.
These may reduce your life expectancy by several months. Do you think that would be a sort of a fair assessment? And then what do you do with the contradiction?
That would be a fair assessment if somebody had actually done the homework to check that there was a spreading pathogen. Certainly the way it was described bore no relationship to reality. I think it's very good that you're raising this question of what went on in Wuhan, because clearly there were people who wanted to do the so-called gain-of-function research, and there were people who wanted to fund them, and maybe some money flowed. Who knows? Maybe they did create new sequences, new virological components. But at the most, what they delivered at the end of their process was really better referred to as claim of function, not gain of function, because we can't see any of that function in the real world. Or to put it another way, if they did make something that kind of leaked or got out or was released or whatever the case may be, it wasn't a bioweapon, it was a bio-pop gun. And so, what I think...
A bio what? A bio-pop-tart? What did he say? I didn't understand that word.
Not gain of function, because we can't see any of that function in the real world. Or to put it another way, if they did make something that kind of leaked or got out or was released or whatever the case may be, it wasn't a bioweapon, it was a bio-pop gun. And so, what I think it is very important to not lose sight of that whole Wuhan story, because I think it's part of the presentation to us of an entirely false dichotomy. This idea that we must choose between the lab leak bioweapon and the zoonotic event, a bat bumping into a pangolin in a bar kind of story. There's no reason that we should have to confine ourselves to those two alternatives. What I believe is more likely is that these PCR tests were dipping into a signal that was already quite widely distributed in the human population. And that what was happening was they were finding those cases as the PCR test spread. That's where the cases spread. It wasn't the spread of a virus, it was the spread of a test. And as people began testing positive, they did so in an environment of hysteria and panic, and massively reduced standards of care in the hospital and nursing home sectors.
Excellent. It's commonly understood in the circles of discourse that you and I presumably.
Now, what you see here is that what would be the right follow-up question would be, well, what biology would that, how would that work? And that's where Gigaohm Biological, I think, needs ignoring, because we got here already a year ago. We had the explanation maybe even 2 years ago, but we've been able to really say it very well for about a year now, maybe a little longer. And I think that's why starting the stream every day with the same 3 statements is really important, because he could have just said it right there. RNA can't pandemic. And JJCouey is the biologist you want to talk about, because he's been working for 4 years to come to that conclusion, to be able to say it so succinctly. And I think he's worth paying attention to. I'm not mad at Nick for not saying it, but this is where it needs to go over the next couple months if we're going to make progress. That's why I'm really excited about June in South Dakota.
Inhabit, although you with more eloquence and understanding than I, that the PCR test itself has been invalidated even by its creator, and who has said it was never designed to be used in the manner that it was deployed during this period, and that the rate of, I don't know, amplification, acceleration, or magnification rendered its results redundant and ultimately irrelevant. But so you're saying that essentially people started testing for something, like if we started testing for freckles tomorrow, we'd say there's a freckle pandemic, people have got freckles everywhere, shut down the shops, put everyone in prison, I've got a freckle medicine, take it. Don't you care about your grandmother, you bastard? Take your freckle medicine. You're an enemy of the state. Are you sure this freckle medicine stops transmission? We've not tested it for transmission. Shut up and take your children out of school.
And then you'd get people like me who have asymptomatic freckles. It's perfect.
Yeah, because there are melanoma and stuff, and where they're probably worth having a good look at. But so my point is that, that's not my point, it's your point. They just started testing for something. But so you're saying that this, and I've heard this idea before, that when people say that the vaccines were patented ages ago, and that people were running test pandemic events, in 2016 or whatever, does your conclusion that there was no pandemic align with that idea, that the COVID has been in the population for ages, 10 years, 5 years, 20 years, whatever, and they just started testing for it, and all those other points I made?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at virus,
you got to be very sharp here, Nick. The right response here would be that the background is noise. It's not that there's COVID in the background. Russell Brand is always distracted. He's not really listening to Nick, so it's a frustrating interview, because you can almost tell that he's jumping through a hoop or finishing a job, or he had to have Nick on, but he knows that he's not supposed to say, oh wow, to really anything. He's just supposed to let him talk and then get it over with. It's frustrating, because Nick should be leading him to an awakening a little bit. It should be like Russell, like, wow, so you mean I've been fooled this whole time into thinking there was a lab leak? He just told him something that should have gone bong, and it did not. And so I think that's because he already knew what Nick was going to say, and he was already prepared with ways to mitigate what he would say.
Virology prior to 2020, people are very clear that the people who believe in the whole theory of virology, at least, are very clear that there are swarms of these things, and they co-evolve in a very complex kind of fashion. So this whole idea that there's a single sequence that races around the world is false. There's what's called a consensus sequence, which is the perceived average across a whole swarm of these things. And there's a lot of controversy around whether these things spread in.
And that's important. That's not biology that we're really talking about anymore. The swarm, and whether or not the swarm was present, was something that we almost got sucked into in early 2024, late 2023, because McKernan was actually trying to get us to take that bait, to have a debate about whether or not clones produce the same subgenomic RNA sequences that the natural virus did. And since they do, then essentially clones are no more virology, or no special than the stuff that they find in the wild. And he refused several times over all the times that we've ever talked to really acknowledge that the main argument that I'm making is not that infectious clones can go around the world better than the natural occurring Batcave virus. I'm making the argument that no matter what RNA molecule you choose or what sequence you create, an RNA molecule by itself is not a pattern integrity, and therefore cannot find itself going from a mud puddle to around the world to include all humans plus zoo populations plus white-tailed deer in North America. That's not possible. There's no biology to support even a tiny minutia of that phenomenon, because RNA can't do that. RNA by itself or in a lipid nanoparticle is not a pattern integrity, but you can make a lot of it. And that's the part that Kevin McKernan understands very well, because since he was apparently a high school science student, he's been working for the Human Genome Project and selling sequencing techniques and methodologies to big companies and starting his own companies and selling them. And now he's on to sequencing marijuana for personalized medicine in 10 years. And so this guy understands that one of the only things that is advanced as far as our ability to manipulate and play with DNA and RNA is our ability to sequence it cheaper and make it cheaper. And of course, making it cheaper means also making more of it. And the more of it we can make, the more uniform a signal we could fake. And of course, Kevin McKernan understands that. Of course, Robert Malone understands that. They've both been working in pharmaceutical companies or parallel industries for decades. They know how biologics are made. And so the idea that somebody like Judy Mikovits doesn't understand that infectious clones are the way RNA virology is done and would be the easiest way to seed the appearance of a pandemic, the appearance of an epidemic, would be to transfect people. Or to, as James Giordano said, transfect one person in Des Moines and one person in Seattle. And the rest you would use are people on the internet with an illusion of consensus that something was happening and that they knew more than you did about it. That's what they did. That's what Nick is trying to get Russell to start to see, and Russell ain't going to see it. Russell's definitely not going to see it, but he's going to let Nick talk.
Intact and robust way, whether they can indeed travel around the world or even outside of your neighborhood. The thing that's been astonishing for me is just in the face of the great complexity of the human body and its interaction with viral particles, how many of these virologists are simply prepared to make massive claims without robust evidence. It's kind of like they have a just so story that they pass down the generations of academics and virology departments. I'm not sure which one of the versions of those stories is better than the next. But certainly when you look at their own work prior to 2020, they never talk in terms of a single stable variant that suddenly spreads to all corners of the planet. So I kind of am very much not at all inclined to go along with any elements of the narrative of a spreading pathogen having caused harm in the human population from 2020 on.
I love that. I mean, so in a sense, what you're saying is about, in a way, taxonomies and semantics, that even to say, like with any virus, not just COVID, you would have to say, well, actually, this thing is evolving so rapidly that to refer to it as a sort of a single object.
So he's still clinging to the virus. He still says, so with any virus. And so Russell, coaching or not, wittingly or not, is playing the role of a biologist here and defending virology and trying to see, okay, so virology's real, but virology's real, but, and Nick just got through saying that the fidelity that they are, he didn't say it as well as he could have because he's not a biologist and hasn't been practicing as long as we have, but the fidelity of virology is where the lie is. They pretend that infectious clones represent a accurate representation of virology in the real world, and they've convinced themselves of this, and it's not. It is a horrible approximation of whatever it is in the real world because of its purity. And this signal in nature does not exist at this purity level, not even close. So whatever the signal is in nature that they may or may not have characterized honestly with PCR and these other techniques, these signals cannot be equated to what can be accomplished with pharmaceutical manufacturing techniques producing pure quantities of DNA or RNA and using bacterial processes or DNA and RNA printing processes to do so. It's not possible. And so once they have sort of done the bait and switch with the shell and convinced you that, oh no, virology is infectious clones are virology. It's fine. Then you have missed the trick, and virology has been completely co-opted in the sense, and a lot of the biology of virology, I believe, is actually found in all of us, but they want us to believe it is the exclusive currency of these obligate parasites that exist as molecules. And I think this is the fundamental lie of virology that was more or less started by and sustained by the work of David Baltimore on this Baltimore scheme of classification. And everybody who agrees to stick to it.
Is reductive. I understand that. That's excellent. Yeah. But will you help me to understand this? Like, this will be sort of, because you're so ardent and informed in your position, it means that I can really get into some lovely devil's advocate stuff. And who better to advocate for than Satan? I was just wondering, imagine, when I cast my mind back, it's the pandemic.
Really? Have I ever made that joke? I mean, now, if you see that as a data point, and there was another data point earlier about the Stations of the Cross, it's just bizarre. I'm sorry, it's just bizarre. Is that the way that Russell Brand undermines himself so that he can say some truthful things, but for whatever reason, the dissonance in his overall behavior will turn most people, of a higher level of thinking off? I don't know. But it's wrong. That is so weird. I'm just going to play it again in case you missed what I'm talking about.
Ardent and informed in your position, it means that I can really get into some lovely devil's advocate stuff. And who better to advocate for than Satan? I was just wondering, imagine, when I cast my mind back, it's the pandemic period, I'm watching the BBC or I'm watching MSNBC, but because I'm British, they stick with the BBC, even though the majority of our audience are American. I would say, I'm watching footage of, a sort of a plucky junior doctor and some nurses, salt of the earth, the people that and I mean this with all sincerity, people that work in industries and areas of our society that should be heralded, applauded, adored, celebrated. I mean, there's no word that I won't use to garland these individuals. And you see them in our intensive care unit, it's full up of people on ventilators, they're dropping like flies. Stay in your homes. No, you can't watch your baby be born. Go and watch funerals on YouTube. All of that stuff. What were they experiencing, Nick? What were they experiencing in those hospitals? Although I will add to this, I do remember in my country, for example, they built I think, as I recall, they built a Florence Nightingale hospital that was there to treat thousands of people. And then it was just never mentioned again. They just stopped mentioning it.
Yeah. Look, I mean, if you put a healthy person on a ventilator or on high flow oxygen for a long time, they're going to drop like flies, right?
There you go. Nice.
Yeah, you can believe that part of the story. And at the same time, the propaganda is driving in the direction of the frontline doctors, the brave people we have to bang our pots and pans for, even though the data was telling us that any doctor under normal retirement age, in vague health, able to work, is not at risk. So what we were in essence dealing with, I think, was there's a lot of signs that the early phenomena that we witnessed in northern Italy, New York City, and later on in the year in Cape Town, in the Western Cape of South Africa, that those events were staged. We can't get anybody to tell us where the actual death certificates are and to explain to us how New York City suddenly jumped to 7.5 times its normal rate of mortality, when meanwhile that happened nowhere else on the planet. What was different about New York City? Well, it looks to us, and I must tip my hat in the direction of the researcher Jessica Hockett, who's done some amazing work on New York City. It looks to me like a completely staged phenomenon.
Yeah, Nick. I'm going to go back and listen to that again, because I think Brand is going to have to deal with that one.
In vague health, able to work, is not at risk. So what we were in essence dealing with, I think, was there's a lot of signs that the early phenomena that we witnessed in northern Italy, New York City, and later on in the year in Cape Town, in the Western Cape of South Africa, that those events were staged. We can't get anybody to tell us where the actual death certificates are and to explain to us how New York City suddenly jumped to 7.5 times its normal rate of mortality, when meanwhile that happened nowhere else on the planet. What was different about New York City? Well, it looks to us, and I must tip my hat in the direction of the researcher Jessica Hockett, who's done some amazing work on New York City. It looks to me.
He looks down. I sometimes am convinced that these people have their phone there where there's a chat open or an iPad with a chat window open. It's something like that. I have my phone right here. If I look I'm looking at my phone now, and then I'm looking at the chat now, and now I'm looking at the video now, just so you can see what I'm doing.
Like a completely staged phenomenon. And it was those events that all the television cameras went in on, and which were so important in driving this narrative that there was an outbreak of a novel deadly virus.
Bloody hell, Nick. All right, so let's... So where we are...
Sorry, Russell. I should also say, I think a lot of doctors were genuine about this. They were tricked into believing that there was something new that they had to respond to differently. And so they abandoned their normal standards of care in good faith, I would say. They were tricked. So this is not to call them all conspiracy theorists or something like that, you know.
I think they were tricked too, but I do think that there were some mistakes that doctors made that allowed them to be tricked. And one of the reasons why I think people don't want to talk about high flow nasal oxygen is because that was one of the things that a lot of doctors missed. I think a lot of doctors and nurses could have known better, but maybe weren't ever taught or never found out because they never worked in an ICU. And the CDC and some other authorities decided to encourage this in places where I guess they didn't have ventilators or whatever. And so the application of high flow pure oxygen, many times I'm willing to bet in situations where the equipment used was insufficient to do it safely, that people that followed the FLCC protocol, for example, and went to the hospital if their pulse ox was 94 or below, you could have had a lot of people into the hospital already just in the James Giordano manner, especially if fueled by something like the FLCC recommendation. And once they got into the hospital, if they were given 2 or 3 hours of high flow pure oxygen without humidification, without a feedback loop that's reading their pulse ox, then it is possible. And in fact, there is scientific literature in the peer-reviewed research from pre-pandemic, even pre-1990, that shows that intensive care unit doctors were already aware of this danger and had already worked on it in monkeys to show that it was worth considering the actual content of the air and the moisture of the air, and that pure oxygen was something that even 80% oxygen was actually undifferentiatable from 100% oxygen in terms of its toxicity to these monkeys. And I think Mark Kulak, as a non-biologist, has done a really good job of just, looking up a few papers and doing a few searches and seeing if any doctors have considered this before. And interestingly enough, this is not a particularly complicated issue. And so it's not something that Mark is going over his skis to try and understand. The words are really simple. It's not very good for those monkeys if it's pure oxygen. And I think there's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there that we were encouraging doctors to use that as a default first go thing when people had COVID. And if that is indeed what has been happening here, ladies and gentlemen, then that is one of the ways where Nick is right, but he's also not right, because a lot of these doctors made mistakes that they probably should have known were mistakes. And one of them is that high flow oxygen. Wherever that happened, they should have probably known better. But the other thing is not using antibiotics on somebody that was presenting with what they could have, from their professional experience, known as bacterial pneumonia. And so if we can go into case by case by case and we see this pattern, then yes, these doctors were fooled. But also at some point, someone at each one of these staff is going to have to take something of a fall or make something of an apology. The senior resident or the chief resident or the head of the department or whatever, because anesthesiologists know this shit. And people that run the ICUs know this stuff. And that's why there are all these products out there which do the things that pure oxygen alone can't do. And yet Mark Kulak has highlighted that we have video from who appears to be Kyle Seidel telling people about really high flow nasal oxygen and running out of oxygen bottles, and the comfort ship that pulled into New York City was actually lauded as having an oxygen plant on it. And video can be seen of people taking oxygen bottles from that boat and loading them to trucks or hurrying to get them to hospitals or whatever. And so we're not there yet, because there are details that we can slam on people when they open the door, like Nick has opened the door, and we could slam those details in right now. And Nick probably just isn't sophisticated enough yet at this interview to know that that should have been said in the other order. It should have been said that high flow, pure oxygen was probably used to injure people that were then put on ventilators. And that's the step that a lot of people have been tricked into skipping, and to assume that, it was just where they ventilated people. No, they got doctors to ventilate people. And the way they got doctors to ventilate people is to watch people deteriorate from pure oxygen, not knowing that that's what was doing it. And then assuming that their deterioration in their own condition, the pain that they were feeling in their lungs, was actually the progression of COVID. And so now we better be careful, and we better put you on a ventilator, and then maybe some of the pain will go away and you'll be able to rest and breathe easier. And there was a coordinated effort to get doctors to be fooled by this. And many of them were fooled. So many of them were fooled that actually Mark Kulak and Jessica Hockett are the two people who started scratching their head about it first. And Mark Kulak is the first guy who went on PubMed and found a paper that was like, holy shit. They already knew this. And so this is a very important detail to now be repeating all the time, and not to be annoyed if you hear Mark and I repeating it all the time, because the potential for understanding here for doctors to wake up is increasing.
Important to add that.
Because I wonder if ever in human history there has ever been such an extraordinary gambit, such an astonishing coup, where reality itself has been warped on an unprecedented scale, where everyone would say between 2019 and 2022 there was a pandemic period, we were locked in our homes. Pfizer, Moderna et al. Came up with a vaccine, and whilst we initially thought it was effective against transmission and reduced hospitalization, the data now is a little harder to read, but there's no question, people say on the legacy media all the time, I've had them say it to my face, that the vaccine saved lives. People will say, why? Just look at Pfizer's stock prices.
I mean, let's just look at another thing. For example, where was it? I might have to just go into my history here. Hold on one second. I'll see if I've got a history that I can look at. Yes, from yesterday. No, 7 days. Oh no, it would have been on YouTube, actually. That's where my history would be. So let me go there. It's going to take me a second, but I think it's worth it. And since we're working here, I don't think Virla is going to stream this afternoon, so I got lots of time to keep shedding. Let's go to history, and I'm going to find this video because I think it's really important. Where's my history? That's over here. And we're going to go down, 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 Oregon A, down, down, farther down. Oh my goodness, sometimes I waste a lot of time on YouTube. So this video is interesting.
Is just as you say, there's a big spike in new cases for Delta. There's not.
So this is a video from, why is that not working? Am I not doing that right? Let me go out of full screen here for a minute, out of this one, and bring up this video. So what I'm interested in pointing out, why won't it do it? Why won't you come over here and let me play you? Up here, there we go. This video is from 2021. It's about a month after he came out on the Brett Weinstein podcast. And of course, one of the things that I'm interested in is understanding the message that some of these pseudo dissidents were pushing in the early part of the pandemic, because I am convinced that they were part of a team worst case scenario Lollapalooza operation, where a bunch of storytellers were released on the American public to make sure that the idea of a worst case scenario lab leak was the primary focus, and that the idea of a circulating pathogen would not be usefully questioned, at least not in 2020 or 2021. And I think Robert Malone was very integral in making sure that the existence of a circulating new pathogen that everybody was vulnerable to was not usefully questioned. And here in this video, I found a little clip where he actually starts talking about how Delta has become a vaccine. It can infect people who were vaccinated. And so in this video, he's actually seeding a narrative where the virus is evolving, and it's evolving away from the vaccination to the original Wuhan spike. What a magnificent chapter in the Scooby-Doo mystery saga that we have endured for the last 4 years, and what an integral part that Robert Malone played in that seeding of the narrative, and making sure that worst case scenario was accepted as possible. First, I'm going to give you this video in the chat so that you can watch it for yourself. And then I'm going to play a little clip of it. I do think I'm already on the clip I want, but it might be that I need to goof around a little bit to find the exact segment where he says Delta and Omicron, or Delta and vaccine evasion. I'm just going to start.
At a minimum, not significantly more pathogenic.
Okay, great. So the other thing that he's going to do here is that he's going to say that a slide deck got leaked from the CDC. And so in 2024, this should also be something that immediately makes you chuckle, because, of course, slide decks don't get released from the CDC by naughty do-gooders. They get released by the CDC and given and promoted by people like Robert Malone to sustain a narrative about a novel virus to which millions of people were vulnerable and died, and that a botched response was the best that we could do. So make no mistake about it. I think this is part of the theater, and I think this is one of the performers of it. And it's because they are performing in a national security context that they are very comfortable and very confident in doing so.
But the slide deck, you can read it yourself, and I put links to that in my Twitter account, or you can get it from the Washington Post. So it clearly documents that Delta is able to infect people that have been previously vaccinated. So that's a bombshell. It also documents that Delta is about as infectious as the chickenpox virus. What that means for those that are technical, epidemiologists in training, which seems like most of us these days, is the R0, the reproductive coefficient, is about 8.
Stop lying!
The higher reproductive coefficient for the alpha variant was about 2 to 2.5.
Stop
so
lying!
We're in the range of, arguably 3 to 4 times more infectious.
So that's a pretty convenient narrative, right? That the original virus wasn't even that infectious, even though Charles Rixey says it's the most infectious virus in many, many decades because of its fear and cleavage site, and has been convinced of that since the beginning of the pandemic, and hasn't changed his mind about the role of the fear and cleavage site any more than Emily Kopp has, or Russell Brand for that matter. We just heard him mention it 10 minutes ago or an hour ago, depending on how long I've been talking. And so I'm not going to waste any more of your time with Robert Malone. I just want to every day remind everyone that there have been these people that have been playing roles in this all the while. And the role that they have played has changed. The story that they have put out has changed, because that's part of the slow roll to the chaos to come. It's the slow roll to the disorder to come. And the goal is for Lollapalooza to have all these crowds of fans all in the same place, and then when the concert's over, have them all turn around and hate each other and burn the whole thing down. And so it doesn't matter what stage you're watching. As long as you're watching one of their stages, your children are about to be enslaved. And in fact, your brain is already enslaved by them and the people they work for. That's what this is all about. Unfortunately, you got to find more people like me and Mark and Jessica. And once you have a few people like that that are working hard to expand what we understand in our world and what we can teach to our kids with confidence, then you'll be edifying your own grasp on reality and building a network that you can share with people. And I humbly submit that Mark and I are a really nice little seed of an intellectual, independent dark web that is worth supporting, unlike a vaccine safety research foundation nonprofit that pays people to tweet and to do things that don't move any balls forward. In fact, don't question the public health system as it should be questioned. So anyway, let's keep going.
Something must have happened. Something must be real. But what you're offering us is, in a sense, a kind of a wave of hysteria. Now, passed across the planet, engineered by a sort of collaborative globalist interests, NGOs. That I'm assuming that the World Health Organization and its rather unique and unusual funding model are involved, that the media have participated in this, and even the sort of the well-intentioned dupes, like at the ground level, people that are participating in medicine, they must now surely have some eerie sense that something wasn't right, that the data doesn't make sense. Like, I'll tell you something that you probably already know, but it's really sort of, it's bugged me since I found out about it. In our country, Britain, they just changed the way they calculate excess deaths because...
Did I say dark web? No, independent bright web. Doggone it. I'm a dork. Sorry about that.
Excess deaths was too high. So they went, oh, we're just changing the way we calculate excess deaths to make the number more manageable. Now, my next question, the question I've been sort of leading to for a couple of minutes now, is if indeed something of such an extraordinary nature has been undertaken, I would like to know why you think it was done.
Yeah, I think there are diverse motives involved. The desire to control other human beings is a story as old as time, and I think that's a significant portion of this. I mean, the United Nations, of which the World Health Organization is but one arm, is pretty accurately described as an organization that seeks to call about a world in which it controls decisions, political decisions, on a global basis. They make no bones about this. They sometimes try to disguise it or soften it, but that is kind of their agenda. I think pharmaceutical firms want to make money. So if the control agenda around pandemic preparedness and viral surveillance and so on is one that the UN is going to get excited about, then, well, they'll get excited too, because they can make loads of money out of that story. And then there are ideologically motivated people, centralists, people who are dumb enough to believe that complex systems can be usefully managed from on high. And all of those people become traveling wayfarers in pursuit of making many of these measures that we saw undertaken permanent features of our landscape. But to answer your question about, have we seen anything like this in history? I think we're living with a couple of them, actually. That was an awakening for me, and I think for many people, is that there are at least two other major ones underway at the same time. The one is this whole modern monetary approach to running our monetary systems, which is basically a kind of theft with a fig leaf on it. And that's happening at an enormous scale that's really underappreciated.
It would be nice if they, I don't know, is it dumb of me to think that fractional reserve banking is a term that people should say out loud? I mean, why not just say it? I don't know quite why we don't just say it. Maybe I'm just dumb.
And the other one is, of course, the whole net zero carbon paranoia story, which is, again, just scientific mumbo jumbo. This idea that these amazing scientists have modeled the entirety of the Earth's climate and they can predict it out for the next 100 years. And no, it's not the case that we're simply emerging from a little ice age. It's this one atom, the atom to kill them all sort of thing. Those are all crazy psyops as well.
Psyops. There are an interesting convergence of interests at play. And as the American comedian George Carlin said, when interests converge, no conspiracy is necessary. And from relatively early in this process, though I was obviously, like many people, probably not including yourself due to the skill set that you announced when telling us your credentials, like autodidact that I am, I was picking through, hold on, that doesn't make sense. This is weird. And then from out of this cacophony of oddness, it was becoming clear that it granted the ability to regulate, it granted the ability to profit, it granted the ability to transfer wealth, it granted it was beneficial to some of the most powerful interests in the world. That became plain. A lot of people regard it, of course, as a staged event. A lot of people, and I suppose this might play into your skill set, in particular as an actuary, that it's becoming understood now that modelling was used and presented as science, and that's perhaps how there was the bypassing of the kind of patterns that you would usually look for in a pandemic, like what you said, clusters and ripples and stuff. So, can you do you feel that when people were saying, we're presenting us with graphs, this many people are going to die, this many people are going to, all of those figures, and then almost the bizarre inversion since then, people were being, these people died of COVID when they fell downstairs, these people died of COVID when they died in a car crash, and since then people, like excess deaths are being sort of mitigated, but extraordinarily, I'm sure you're familiar with Pierre Corey, the insurance companies are having to change the way they charge premiums. AstraZeneca are in court. I mean, it's unavoidable. The reckoning is unavoidable. So, can you point to some of the sort of major, firstly, some of the major tools for ensuring that we bought into this reality, and the major tools that help us to understand that the reality was false? Just easy examples.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the type of modeling that was used to produce these very inflated predictions at a country level is really not even appropriately used at a country level. Those models are called SIR models. They make a range of assumptions, one of which is that all the members of that population mix evenly. It's a concept called pan-mixia. And that's appropriate at the level of something like a herd of cattle, right? Or maybe you could say children in one school. But it's certainly not an appropriate assumption for the whole country. So, the very axiomatic underpinnings of these models are invalidated by the nature of the applications.
And now he's going to miss the opportunity, but it's hard on one of these live shows, but he's going to miss the opportunity to say that by orchestrating a few local mass casualty events with the combination of fraud and deadly protocols, panic and fear, they were able to create the illusion of data that could be then extrapolated with one of these very simple models and projected into the future as evidence of the start of something very dangerous. And so I'm happy that he wants to say all of the problems with these models and, mixing and whatever else, but it would be much more succinct and understandable for the average TV watcher to just hear what he said earlier is that I think some of these events were staged, and that these staged events now, in this question, he could refer back to it and say, and those stage events using modeling can be easily misconstrued as the beginning of a very big crisis, a worst case scenario where 1 billion people could die, like Kevin McCairn said in March of 2020. And this, again, it takes practice. We're going to have to get Nick in front of other people. We need to get other people in front of other people that can say it. And when the ball is in front of the goal, they can kick it straight in. This is a point where if he doesn't get there to kick it straight in, we have to remember this as a rhetorical or semantic turning point here, where when we get into the next conversation and somebody says this, we have to make sure that we say that, remember what we said, that there was a mass casualty event in New York City. Now imagine if the CDC took that and said, and used these simple models to extrapolate that and project danger, because that's what the SAGE group did in the UK. That's what the CDC did in America. And they showed it on PBS NewsHour that way on purpose, with dotted lines going into the future. And so there was the opportunity, not to say that the models suck, but sucky models were used to take the numbers from a mass casualty event and project a crisis. And so there was a way to samurai sword this, and then there was a way to kind of not. And I don't think he's going to manage to do it, but it's not a big deal. It's just that we got to get better.
Using. And my experience, I mean, I hate to sound arrogant about this, but in general, there's just very low quality intellects manning those models. They don't even understand what the assumptions are and what they mean and what the limitations of those assumptions would be. So we took aim at those models very early on. We tossed out that whole class of modeling and used a much simpler approach called empirical modeling, where you're actually looking at what's happening and just use those empirical models to predict when those other SIR models would fail. And we did that very accurately, and it upset those models a lot. But there was another more insidious way in which the models were used. Remember those dashboards? Yeah, I kick myself when I think about them, because it didn't strike me at the time. But how did the world suddenly become capable of tracking every case and death in every single country from a single disease that is very hard to distinguish from a whole lot of other diseases?
I mean, we didn't even have testing for it, right? And of course, this is one of the things that you can feel very much like John Cullen and Goodman, John Cullen's claim to fame is that apparently he created the code that was used in that map with red spots. But then that also means that he would be well aware of that the map with the red spots was just a modeling projection based on no numbers at all, not on numbers. But that's never been his story. That's never been part of his story. And now you see why somebody like that is probably attached to George Webb and these other people and going on all of these tangents on purpose, because that's his job. It's part of this, endless list of promoted, not controlled. The right word is scripted. They know what they can talk about and what they can't. They know what they got gold stars for talking about and what they didn't. And they just follow the advice of who's ever advising them. And the only person who's advising me is regular guy and my wife. I don't really have any other advisors. I guess I would consider Greg Glassman an advisor if he would ever call me, but he only calls me like once a year to just say hi and invite me to his house for a broken science meeting. But he would be a very big influence on me, and is indirectly through the people that he's connected me with. But I've spoken to Jay Bhattacharya more than 10 times, I think, in the past year, and I wouldn't consider him an advisor. I've spoken to Bobby Kennedy 10 times or so in the last 10 years, the last 2 years, and I wouldn't consider him an advisor. I'm closer to a couple of the people that I met at CHD and working with them. I'm still closer to them than I am to anybody that I worked with in neuroscience, with the exception of my IT guy, a former IT guy from Pitt. That guy I'm still friends with, but no biologists. And a few people from CHD are still in great contact with me, because what happened there wasn't right. What happened there reflects the absolute total control that this operation is. And CHD, I think even people inside of CHD are well aware of the fact that something isn't right, that they don't go as far as they could, that a lot of money gets wasted and they don't know where it goes, and they don't even know how much money they have and who's spending it on what. And, because it's a lot of people that are working very, very hard to try and fight, despite all of the people who aren't actually pulling on the rope. Because that's what CHD is. It's like 100 people in a tug of war, and 90 people in that tug of war are pulling as hard as they can and getting blisters on their hands and putting all of their life into it, and the other 10 are just kind of holding the rope and actually making phone calls with the team on the other side of the rope and letting the other team know when they're pulling really hard and when they're not, or when somebody needs a break. That's what's happening at CHD. That's how I got kicked out of that, dropped out of that university or that group. And so, it's 90 people out of 100 are awesome in that group. And Brian Hooker is probably the reason why that whole group even exists, is to keep him under wraps and to make sure that whatever he does, like, sells a green book with 100% truth in it from beginning to the end, they'll sell a bunch of red books too that don't have truth in them from beginning to end, and it'll balance out. Brian Hooker or someone with a severely damaged adult autistic child should be in control of CHD. And in all of the positions of power in CHD, someone who's got real skin in the game should be there, but that's not the way it is. The people with real skin in the game have positions of subordinate power and get told what to do and what to focus on. That's how that organization works. And I ran into the people at the top of that organization, and that's why I am where I am and why I have the opinion of the organization that I do. I know that all the people beyond the big chairs are awesome and fantastic and well-meaning, and we're ahead of the curve and ahead of this story before I ever had my head out before the pandemic. I know that. And I humbly submit that those people need a new place to go. They need to take over CHD and kick the bad people out. The saboteurs need to be removed. The problem is that it's a nonprofit. So you have this, executive board of people that raises money, and then you have these people, and all those people have influence and money, and there's no control from the people underneath. They're just, they can be dismissed in a day, like I was, if you do the wrong program on Christmas Eve. It is a very, very big show with lots of stages.
When the World Health Organization tracks diseases around the world, it takes years for them to put out the reports. And yet suddenly we had this ability to pump out the reports on the day. Well, of course, we didn't have that ability. And of course, what was happening is they were using models to drive substantial portions of those dashboards. So the data that was ticking up on our screens and driving the fear wasn't actually emanating entirely from the real world, but also from completely fabricated models. And in a very funny twist of fate, we actually found the GitHub sites where these guys were practicing using models for that purpose, for faking real world data. And they used the same class of models.
Somebody also said that in the chat, that they were actually using model data sets to feed their models. And it's totally right. And that's really where a lot of academic science is now spiraling into complete irrelevance. It's how we're going to move forward, and why we are definitely not going to be talking about the pandemic 5 days or 7 days a week. That's not necessary anymore, given the fact that in any one of these study halls, we can pretty much hit all the bases every time.
SRR models. So it all gets rather creepy rather fast. And when you open your eyes to the depth and breadth of the frauds here, it does cause people to glitch. I mean, you asked the question at the beginning of this, your last interview there. You said, people are saying this whole thing was staged, and was there a conspiracy? My day job, when I'm not trying to lead the fight against the globalists, my day job is that of a private equity investor. So I spend a lot of time in boardrooms, and I'll tell you now, with no fear of contradiction, conspiracies are a dime a dozen. Every time a board of directors gets together in a room, there's some form of conspiracy going on. That's the nature of the real world. People are in a competitive space, and they're trying to have asymmetric information to steal a march on a competitor, or to make a customer believe that their product is better than it really is, something of that nature. So, this idea that a conspiracy is a sort of a once in a millennium kind of event is completely false. They're all over the place. And there clearly are elements of conspiracy riddled. They absolutely riddle the coronavirus landscape. And this whole sort of epithet of woo-woo conspiracy theorist is actually, that's the people who use that as a slur are very divorced from reality.
So, in a sense, this area of conversation is just one component of a broader purview. Before we park it, if I may be so bold, I wonder if you feel that the WHO treaty that's currently being proposed is an attempt to redress and nullify the opponents of the plan that was enacted previously, in so much as it includes, we want the ability to vaccinate entire populations and bypass national sovereignty, we want the ability to censor, we want the ability to determine what constitutes a pandemic. Do you agree that that's what this WHO treaty is for? And if it is, what is the nature of this organization, the WHO, and how does its power relate to sort of some of the emergent villains of this period? Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, some of the sort of big names that emerged during this period.
So I do agree with you that that's what is going on with the treaty. The relationships are complex, and people tend to oversimplify them. I've heard people say that Bill Gates funds the World Health Organization, that China funds the World Health Organization, that Germany funds the World Health Organization, and all of those are true. And there's competition for control and power in that organization, and so different pressures to abuse the organization too. And it has been for many years. I mean,
wow, Cheetah, are they really going to use the electronic health record to define diseases now? Because that is That's next level. That's a nice one. If you got a link for that, I would love that.
In 2009, the World Health Organization was the main actor in an attempt to pull off a fraud similar to the coronavirus fraud in the case of swine flu.
And so he's citing 2009, which we've also studied in the context of a 2017 or 2018 Chatham House presentation by a guy by the name of Mark van Ronst, who played the flu commissar in Belgium for the flu pandemic of 2009. And in that lecture of an hour long at the Chatham House, he makes all kinds of statements which belie the idea that this is an elaborate operation. It's an agreed upon narrative that all of these people have been fine-tuning in order to increase compliance to a global level. And that video needs to be revisited. I think I probably should just watch it again on another study hall, because I'll have different insight and better and more accurate interpretation of it now, a couple years later. But there is no question that this is an ongoing revised script in which we find ourselves. And even in the SPARS pandemic document on page 50-something, you will find part of the narrative has to do with the injuries due to the countermeasure that was rolled out during the pandemic. So this is all part of the script. That's why we couldn't get here with Robert Malone and Steve Kirsch and Brett Weinstein pretending to be heroes and pretending to tell us the truth until now, even though a lot of what they say is the truth was the narrative that I was running around with my head cut off in 2020 spreading. So we could have been here in 2020 if they wanted us to, but that's not how one of these plans works. And you can see that very clearly from a document like the SPARS pandemic document, because it is a document that describes an operation over many years, a narrative over many years. And we are in the middle of such a narrative. And I suspect that the chaos to come with regard to the election is also already part of that scripted narrative. We just don't have the script.
And that was replete with all the same things. They wanted to come out with a new vaccine and vaccine mandates and do all of those things, but they kind of got caught out. They weren't practiced enough at that stage. So this is sort of a repeat attempt, and this time they were a lot better. They'd learned their lessons along the way. So I mean, what are we really talking about? It's an organization hell-bent on taking a highly centralized approach to a complex phenomenon. And it also fits into a very important pattern. I think it's the most important pattern to understand in the world. And that is the simple three-part pattern of global crisis, presented as only admitting global solutions, and under conditions of censorship of dissenting voices. So the claim of a global crisis, the claim that it only can be addressed by global solutions, and that we need to censor everybody who disagrees. If you've got those three things in place, you're dealing with a scam 100% all of the time. And that is a feature of the coronavirus story quite clearly, and of this whole pandemic preparedness story, which is nonsense from beginning to end. And it's a feature of the whole climate crisis story. As soon as it's
actually a feature also of the equity and sustainability story, which maybe is part of the climate thing. But all of these things are portrayed as global problems needing global solutions. And so he's right. And I think he's one of the first people to enunciate it so eloquently as to say that anytime they say that this is a global problem that needs global solutions and that people who are opposed to it can't be allowed to be heard is definitely a scam.
Have those things. We are dealing with a scam, and the perpetrators of those scams are invariably people who believe in their own ability to lord it over all of us from the center of the universe, in the ability of clever people like them to control complex systems using spreadsheets.
Or they are well aware that we are governed by this mythology, that we can do that we are doing that's what happens. And that can also be part of it. I think a lot of the people in the Club of Rome are very well aware that that's how we are being governed right now, and are all about it because they have objectives in doing so. And that includes, some peaceful transition to a smaller population, and a peaceful transition to global governance, and a peaceful transition to an electronic digital currency mechanism.
Do you think it's interesting that
the war on terror also has that feature? Well done.
Figures that are, let's put it even delicately, on the margins of our culture, are even precursors to the kind of online pundits that have become more common due to the emergence of and accessibility of the technology. Maybe you would say like figures like David Icke, Alex Jones. who were like 10, 15 years ago saying there will be global events that will be used to legitimize centralized authoritarianism. They want they want to implement social credit score like measures. What do we do with that when some of the people that are kind of really derided by what you might call the sort of legacy media rationalists, and certainly amidst their output, and I often consider both Ike and Alex Jones to be more like shaman than any, in a sense, like
Robert Malone declared that Alex Jones was a guy who could see around corners and was a legendary American hero. And he said that last week. Or maybe it was this week. No, it would have been last week because today's Monday. Just so you're aware, Alex Jones is considered a hero by Robert Malone and a guy who can see around corners. I don't know if that undermines Robert Malone's credibility in your mind or not, but I know what it does for me.
Our culture has evolved to the point where those kind of voices are by their nature marginalized. There's no room for people that sort of speak I don't know, metaphysically, somewhat mystically. The point I'm trying to make is they were saying that for some time there would be events of this nature, and I was reminded of that fact when you said global event shuts down dissent. I mean, does it apply to escalating geopolitical crises that are unpopular? That if there were decentralized councils, subsidiarities, Soviets, syndicates, call it what you will, federalization, it is very unlikely that people would vote to continue wars in the Middle East, vote to continue to fund Ukraine, Russia, vote to agitate China. Indeed, isolationism starts, and beyond that, devolution beyond national isolationism seems like it's something that will be appealing. I'm talking about, of course, decentralization. And do you think that people that there is a sense that the tendency is towards decentralization, and in order to oppose that, you have to assert and impose centralization aggressively and legitimize it through crisis?
Yeah, sorry, lots of points to pick up on there.
Yeah.
First on Ike and Alex Jones and so on. I think we can't underestimate the extent that we're surrounded by the sort of fog of the info war. Because as much as there are people like them who apparently ran the alarm bell and so on, there are also people who say that they are CIA creations and that their role is to say some true things, but to salt them with a bunch of nonsense about lizard people or about fake events that were actually real and so on. Now, it's very hard for any person, no matter how well informed, to actually come to clear conclusions about all of these things. So my sense or my advice, I guess, to people.
What a wonderful way to say it, Nick. And I love how humble he is about this, that, he doesn't know because he understands. He's not saying it like I say it, but, if all these people have agreed to lie, and then you can be as smart as you want, you're not going to figure it out. That's the thing I'm trying to teach to my kids. If the people on the news don't know and they just read what they're told to read, and the people that are putting the words in front of them are liars, and if the national security state has been governing us like this for a long time because of the way that our financial system works, and now you understand why it was so easy for them to convert to complete COVID, complete pandemic, and know that it was going to work. Because they'd already been doing it. The choir was already singing. They just sang a different song. That's the part that a lot of people still aren't quite seeing. That choir extended into the internet, and the people like Joe Rogan, Brett Weinstein, Alex Berenson. All of these people were in place singing a very different song, and then their song changed, and it has slowly progressed exactly as the script desired, making sure that people were caught up in the Scooby-Doo and unable to exercise informed consent, which includes saying no. And here we are in 2024 in May, and still nobody is saying transfection, and nobody is saying that RNA virology is an exaggeration based on infectious clones. And maybe in a couple years we'll be saying it. Maybe.
Is just to preserve a bit of skepticism, to listen, to not be dismissive of people with crazy ideas, because sometimes they're right, but also not to go too far down each and every rabbit hole, just to understand that we're living in a chaotic and turbulent time where there's a vast tracts of utterly false propaganda out there. Sorry, just remind me, give me a hook for your second part of your question. You were asking about whether...
Well, to comment on what you just said, is like it's always helpful when there is verifiable ideas that you can corroborate. Like, I can see, looking at this data, that they used modeling to amplify the threat. I can see now that they claimed that they developed a vaccine in record time, and so how would they know what the side effects would be over 5 or 10 years?
No, they used a mass casualty event to imply a threat that didn't exist. So Russell didn't get there yet, and in fact, he repeated the neutered version of what Nick had just said. So that's important to notice here, because he's still not getting it right.
Part of your question, you were asking about whether...
Well, to comment on what you just said, is like it's always helpful when there is verifiable ideas that you can corroborate. Like, I can see, looking at this data, that they used modeling to amplify the threat. I can see now that they claimed that they developed a vaccine in record time, and so how would they know what the side effects would be over 5 or 10 years? So yeah, So, and then what I said was,
but why would the scenario of there being a delayed admission of vaccine injury actually be in the SPARS pandemic scenario? And why in that public-facing brochure of a pandemic scenario called the SPARS pandemic would there be a character in that chapter called Epigirl, which was responsible for seeding the narrative about vaccine injury and amplifying it? Unless the secret, real version of that document included lots of epigirls being there and ready to control the narrative, to be amplified by programming, so that everybody thought, wow, this person is cool. Wow, this person is great. And the people who were really fighting for the truth could just be languishing in the background, unable to get their message to go anywhere because it's been programmed not to. Please, ladies and gentlemen, they told us the plan. They told it to us. They printed it out. They gave it to us in PDF form, and none of us were paying attention enough in the early stages to actually see it, including me. I owe the world an apology for what I did at the end of 2020 and the beginning of 2021, where I really wrote a review selling the idea that the transfection could be changing the evolutionary trajectory of a virus that might have been leaked from a laboratory. And the people that encouraged me to do that, the people that influenced me and egged me on, they're all part of this group of people that I now disavow, and I now claim, at the risk of my family's future, that they were actually working against us all along. That's my message. I'm sticking to it.
Originally, Nick, was, do you feel that the reason that centralized authoritarianism is because precisely the opposite is there's an inertia towards it?
Look, that's exactly where the tension is. And I've been talking as many times as I possibly can about the importance of understanding what a problem centralization is, because we're not taught this in schools. It used to be a fairly current idea. This used to be taught in economics departments, and people understood it, I think, a great deal more 50 years ago than they do now. But the important thing about centralization is that it is incompatible with progress. You cannot have an authoritarian system and expect to see the knowledge growth, which is the only driver of an improvement in living standards and of economic growth, of what people like to call progress. And the reason for this is that in the face of complexity, the only way that we can navigate this is the world. We can't go and design our solutions from on high using complicated models, et cetera, et cetera. That's illusory. The only thing we can do is experiment on the edges. We can tinker. We can try this, try that. And that's where you get the idea of a distributed system, coming up with solutions that are better than a highly centralized system. And so there are a couple of things going on here. You can't centralize without censorship. You can't centralize without authoritarianism. Centralization requires the suppression of dissent, and it entails the suppression of knowledge growth and of economic growth and of human flourishing. Now, some people think that's a good idea. They have, for example, an ethic of wanting to protect the planet and regarding humans as kind of a kind of pathetic scum.
I think you should modify that a little bit, M.Tam Fisher, to say that centralized education is authoritarianism, but decentralized education might be all right, like apprenticeships and things like that, right?
On its otherwise beautiful surface. I'm not one of those people. I think the human brain is the most remarkable entity in the universe, and that the human individual enjoys sanctity and needs to be protected from authoritarians and has rights over the planet and the universe and all the inanimate objects. That's where my belief system is. But there are people who believe exactly the opposite, and that is the war at the moment. There are the would-be centralizers who want to control, who want to give rise to a kind of Malthusian utopia in their minds. This world where we stop increasing how much we consume and how much energy we utilize and so on, and where the story is told in terms of degrowth and rationing. And then there are people like me who believe that there is no end to the powers of curiosity and human ingenuity, and how the best way to see a flourishing world come about is to drive in the direction of decentralization and distribution of power.
You might think I seem caffeinated enough. I ain't caffeinated. I have alarm in the high coffee that loves you. 1772 is the code. Agree with you. Aspect of between Mutiny on the Bounty and Last Tango in Paris era, which is an overlooked aspect of ripening Brando. We've been sent a few assets from our community that I just wanted to draw your attention to. I have to ensure that they are legitimate. One is a Bill Gates post that someone has highlighted. Let me know in the chat who it was that posted this. What's next for our foundation? I'm particularly excited about what the next year could mean for one of the best buys in global health, vaccines, 12/19/19. So what's that, the 19th of December, 2029. So we should, I'm not sure that that's legit, but like it's been posted in the chat.
No, that's right.
Oh,
that was legit.
That's legit. That's cool.
That's legit, and it came just after Event 201, which he was centrally involved in.
Let's have a look at Event 201.
Yeah. So I mean, there was foreknowledge, there was planning. The very interesting thing to study is the timeline of January 2020. I mean, when you actually lay it all out, what happened in these 30 days, the supposed volume of science that was conducted after an eye doctor spotted an unusual pneumonia in Wuhan on the 30th of December 2019. This eye doctor, he suddenly diagnosed as unusual pneumonia. And
one of the things that he's probably not going to mention because, he's got a lot of things he's trying to mention is that one of the extraordinary things that happened in January of 2020 in a matter of weeks is that the entire pharmaceutical catalog of the FDA, all nutraceuticals and pharmaceuticals, were scanned against a computer-generated model of the X-ray crystallography of the 3CL protease in the virus. Even though they only had a sequence, Robert Malone's DITRA team was spun up, mostly made up of volunteers, and within 3 weeks they had identified from this scan famotidine, celecoxib, ivermectin, and remdesivir. And then he spent the next year helping people navigate the emergency use authorization pipeline and seeking patentable combinations of repurposed drugs in the catalog of the FDA. And that's how he met Steve Kirsch, who on June 21st, 2021, joined him on the Brett Weinstein podcast to save no one.
From there's this 30-day, zip line through the world of medical science that drops out the PCR tests, the sequencing of the virus, the characterization of the illness, this finding that there was deadly asymptomatic transmission, and all of this stuff suddenly materializes in 30 days. That didn't happen by accident. It was premeditated, and it was bullshit from start to finish. Don't take any part of what I'm saying as suggesting that there was an absence of pre-planning or foreknowledge. It's just that it might not have been as widespread as a whole lot of people actually think.
Yes. Thank you.
Absence of by accident. It was premeditated, and it was bullshit from PCR tests, the sequencing of the virus, the characterization of the illness, this finding that there was deadly asymptomatic transmission, and all of this stuff suddenly materializes in 30 days. That didn't happen by accident. It was premeditated, and it was bullshit from start to finish. Don't take any part of what I'm saying as suggesting that there was an absence of pre-planning or foreknowledge. It's just that it might not have been as widespread as a whole lot of people actually think.
Yes. Thank you for explaining that. Can you pull up that flu thing? I'm not sure that actually Nick can't see our assets.
I can. I saw the last one.
Oh, cool. So this is all right. So this is an antigen test kit asset. Can you? Is this a legit asset? Does it make sense according to your expertise? Because I'm just pulling these things. This is content provided by our Awake and Wonder community. So I just want to make sure that who knows what kind of lunatic.
Flu disappeared.
Yeah, we're all.
I just look at those numbers, of course. Yeah, and there's this idea that it's some kind of environmental competition, but we can invalidate that very easily because flu even disappeared from places where there was no COVID. So something was going on. Somebody was gaming the testing system for flu, or people simply were stopped testing for it, or something like that. Or the entire story of influenza is itself riddled with bad science and contradictions.
There you go, Nick.
But yeah, your
there you go. There you got it at the end.
Who flags that as a very suspicious story is, I believe, correct.
I also wonder, there was a moment where they said that, they couldn't allow vaccines to be manufactured in various African nations because of patenting laws, and also just because they wouldn't be able.
Wrong question, Russell, but that's all right. That's your job.
Somewhat racistly, they seem to imply that in Africa, where you're obviously from, they wouldn't be able to make the vaccines for one reason or another. I wonder if there's data available now. Presumably, there were lower vaccination rates in those nations. I wonder if there's any interesting data as a result of that.
Outlook is good.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of interesting data, but it's very hard to get clean data that's honestly collected and that isn't in some way misrepresented by researchers who are ultimately funded by pharmaceutical companies. But I'll just give you a little simple data point here. In South Africa, there was very low vaccine take-up. About 30% of the population had either one dose of J&J or two of Pfizer. But when the booster shot came around, I'm talking about the first booster.
I only started saying this yesterday, so I'm going to say it again just for the cheap sheets. It's important to acknowledge that on one hand, Robert Malone really wants you to believe that he put his career on the line and actually lost it to speak out on behalf of Jesse Gelsinger's death, or speak out about Jesse Gelsinger's death. But at the same time, at the beginning of the pandemic, he didn't have the wherewithal to say, hey, I threw my career away once for to speak out against the use of adenovirus to transform or transfect healthy humans. And I don't think that using an adenovirus to vaccinate people is going to work. I think that just sounds like transformation or transfection, the stuff that I spoke out about a decade ago with regard to Jesse Gelsinger. Somehow or another, Robert Malone didn't come out and speak out until after AstraZeneca and J&J were actually pulled from the market and the mRNA was being rolled out. That's a really weird data point that no one seemed to notice, but it's pretty significant to me.
I think the uptake rate was like 1.5%. So the population voted with their feet. They realized that something was wrong. Now, according to the claims of the media and the pharmaceutical companies, that should have led to there being vast mass death in South Africa because 70% of the population remained unvaccinated. But COVID has just stopped. It's a non-entity. Nobody cares. It's gone. So this idea that the vaccines in the UK or whatever stopped the pandemic is false.
We don't hear that very often. It's a good data point. I'm glad that we heard it in this one. There are countries that didn't vaccinate, and they're fine too. So the effectiveness and how many people were saved by it is really a narrative that depends on where you are, because the narrative either can be made to fit or it can't.
Come and explain to me what happened then here in my hometown of Cape Town. Yeah, how did we stop here? No, it stopped because everybody stopped going bananas and putting numbers up on screens and treating people with chest infection because 70% of the population remained under. So the population voted with their feet. They realized that something was wrong. Now, according to the claims of the media and the pharmaceutical companies, that should have led to there being vast mass death in South Africa because 70% of the population remained unvaccinated. But COVID has just stopped. It's a non-entity. Nobody cares. It's gone. So this idea
I replayed that for you, J. Kelly
UK
K.
or whatever, stop the pandemic is false. You've got to come and explain to me what happened then here in my hometown of Cape Town. Yeah, how did we stop here? No, it stopped because everybody stopped going bananas and putting numbers up on screens and treating people with chest infections in stupid ways, in deadly ways. Yeah, I don't think too much more needs to be said. The whole thing's absurd. I mean, the vaccines were a scientific fraud by the standards of Pfizer's own phase 3 trials. The vaccines increased your likelihood of dying, increased your likelihood of hospitalization, increased your likelihood of serious illness, and increased your likelihood of COVID symptoms. The only thing they did was for a very small number that was very biased in its selection, they stopped. They reduced the likelihood of COVID symptoms in conjunction with a PCR test. Now that is of no good to man or beast. So that's a scientific fraud right there. And that was the whole basis of this 95% efficacy claim. So I just don't see how any person with a modicum of common sense can perpetuate this idea that the vaccines were at all effective as a therapy. The real question is simply how dangerous they were. And there, I think I'm somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. They've definitely caused a lot of harm because they were rolled out on such vast scale to people who really didn't need them for the most part. And that's the case. It's caused some harm, but I don't think it's going to cause the harms on the scale that people like Zelenko and Geert van den Bosch, have predicted that billions of people would die from them.
I wish he wouldn't have said that Zelenko said that. Zelenko may have said that a lot of people are going to be injured from the shot and they'll die from it, and they still may. I still think it's very possible that my friend Nate is not an anomaly, but just somebody that went earlier than other people will go. It took my friend Nate about a year to die. That doesn't mean that it won't. Maybe his daughters will die of a heart attack in 4 years from now. And so at what time scale will the damage from the transfection be seen? We don't know. We really don't. And I think it's a very legitimate scientific position to take that we don't know. And part of that has to do with the fact that Craig Partakoper showed us that there could be differences in the effective dose that people have received. And so the effective damage that was done is unknown and may need a lot more work to clarify who potentially was damaged and who wasn't. Last night on the VSRF replay that I watched of Robert Malone, he goes in for 20 minutes to try and make sure that, I took the shot and I got hurt from it. And one of the batch that I had was a hot batch. And so he went out of his way the other day to reiterate that he took the shot, that it hurt him, that he was misled. He actually also accused Peter Cullis of lying to him. That's why I was almost going to do that video today, because it's very extraordinary. He actually says that Peter Cullis lied to him and said to him that they had solved the localization problem using novel lipids and chemical coatings. But we have a lecture from 2022 where he laughs because he says, we never solved that problem. I burnt 5 postdocs on it, and the last postdoc said she wanted to change her project or she was going to quit. It's a pretty bold accusation to say that Peter Cullis lied to you and assured you that everything was okay, and then now turn around and say that I'm vaccine injured because Peter Cullis lied to me. And in the same exact conversation with Steve Kirsch, he also says that Peter Cullis should have gotten a Nobel Prize because he invented the carrier. I mean, it's hard to hold the level and weight of the cognitive dissonance that is required in order to listen to these people talk, these liars, these posers, these performers. And so I'm going to keep using time on Nick Hudson, because Nick Hudson is one of these people who has humbly tried to figure it out without assuming that he knows. He didn't come on the stage as an expert and is not on the stage as an expert now, even though he's an actuary and could talk about numbers. While Robert Malone is introduced by Steve Kirsch on his Vaccine Research Safety Council fraud as the legendary disambiguation wizard. Is that what he called himself at some point? We will break free, ladies and gentlemen, once we see them.
Do you think that dissent and dissidents emerging from independent media, figures like Jay Bhattacharya, Peter McCulloch, obviously people that were like Robert Malone that were on Joe Rogan, do you think that intervened, interrupted and disrupted what may have otherwise happened? Were those voices extracted or otherwise silenced?
Look, they all came, those ones you name all came rather too late, with the exception, I think, of Bhattacharya and Kuldoff and Gupta, who objected to the lockdowns. And I think, look, I mean, I should just, in the interest of full disclosure, I get a lot of bad press amongst several of the names you just mentioned, because they're fundamentally, for the most part, they believe there was this pandemic and you needed early treatments to, and if you didn't do the early treatments, millions of people would die and so on. I just don't go along with that version of the world. They know it. and it puts us to an extent at loggerheads. I don't need to be. I'm happy with diversity of opinion and disagreement.
And we saw a spectacular video 2 or 3 days ago. If you've missed it, because we're putting a show out every day, and it's always 2 hours long, and so it's hard to keep up. We did a really deep dive into a Tom Cowan question and answer that he did on May 1st of this year, which is really like a week ago. And he is very eloquent in describing how the early treatment use of ivermectin has been used as a trick. And he explained it very eloquently, and then pivoted in the next sentence to say that there are no ion channels, there are no action potentials, and that the brain, we don't know how the brain works. Anything about how the brain works. Everything that we know about membrane physiology is wrong. And it was exactly as we could characterize somebody like David Icke or Alex Jones or Tucker Carlson. They are allowed to say certain things. They are allowed to put certain pieces of wood on the fire, but other pieces of wood are not allowed to be burned. Those are for other people. They're standing at a different part of the train that they're all collectively agreeing to pretend to stop and start. And early treatment was one of those charades where we had people on both sides or all sides of the train pretending that that was a relevant thing to do and a relevant thing to fight about. And so it's really was just a wonderful, curious thing to see Tom Cowan be able to so eloquently explain how they would mislead people about early treatment and the effectiveness of ivermectin, but he couldn't pivot to say that because the lie of virology is so important, they were willing to murder people in New York City and elsewhere in order to sustain the lie. And they still haven't gotten there in 4.5 years of their hamster wheel running.
But what a lot of those people end up doing is blocking me and doing the same censorship that they complain about, you know. So I'm not too sure that we or they stopped anything of significance. Everything came too late. The lockdowns had gone on for years. The vaccines had gone into billions of people's arms.
I agree about the hot batch being one of those things where I ignored most of it because, again, it would before Craig Partakoper would be on my show. Somebody by the name of Sasha Latipova called me and said, or emailed me and said she'd be happy to speak. And so I heard it first from Sasha on my own show. And I guess I kind of took her seriously for a while, but now I am well aware of the extent to which she's just a player. Having been on stage with Robert Malone about a year ago in Stockholm, and having a daughter that was promoted by Alex Jones multiple times before the pandemic, there can be no question in my mind that she's a retired pharmacy executive turned national security meddler. Very similar to Robert Malone, very similar to some of these other people that we have now dead to rights because they have lied to my face. And so the things that I talk about are not hearsay. The things that I talk about are not based on speculation or other people's lies. They are based on personal experience, personal communication between these people and what they said to me in 1 year versus the next. That's why I feel very confident in calling some of these people out for what they're doing.
And almost everybody on the planet had, everybody in a Western country had bought into this false notion that there was a novel deadly virus that they needed to be protected from and that there will be more pandemics in future. So the victory, I think, has been achieved. What the purpose here was to drive home the need for pandemic preparedness, for vast budgets of tens of billions of dollars a year used in viral surveillance and stockpiling of crazy medicines and increasing vaccine manufacturing capacity and all this kind of thing. Now, to that extent, they've won. They've got their budgets. They're doing it again and again. They're getting.
But the other thing was to exhaust the economic system. The other thing was to destroy the economic system. That's the other thing that they did. That's the reason why I started the show the way that I did. Because although I'm not an economist, I do understand the big picture, I think, pretty well. And that is that our financial system has been a house of cards for a very long time, and they have been building the house of cards bigger and bigger all along, knowing that it was going to collapse. And they are already moving along their plan to take advantage of that collapse. And they already have a plan of how they want to reorient human civilization after that collapse. And so the collapse just can't happen tomorrow. The collapse has to be a very controlled demolition so that the assumption of what is happening and the acceptance of the solution to what is happening is total. Otherwise, it won't work.
Give us another monkeypox and now a bird flu, and it'll all be manufactured and it'll all be complete and utter nonsense. But they've got a population in many countries that's accepted this whole canard, and that will go with it. So there was no victory here. We didn't stop anything. And that's important to remember. It doesn't mean we can't stop anything in future. I think that we've got to win the battle here still. It's the next one that's going to be very interesting.
Absolutely it is, and that's exactly it. The batches were, of course there were batches because they needed test data. And of course there were probably placebo batches to make it even harder for people to see that they were testing these things, testing out toxicity levels, effective dose, all of this stuff. Absolutely. Maybe even different carrier lipid combinations, I think is also a very good possibility for how these batches were varied in order to make sure that the suite of adverse reactions would be variable enough so that they could be dismissed, and also so that they would get useful data. Absolutely, Herbert Hayes. Absolutely.
But man, there are so many big stories, so many big narratives that we have to push back against. It's, as you say, I like the way you talk about awakenings all the time. It's the same word that I use. I think we're getting more awake people. And it's never been the case in history that 90% of a population woke up to any ruse or mythology. It's always some substantial minority that figures it out, the kind of lateral thinkers who are always a minority. And the linear thinkers go along with the story and do the office jobs and how man the bureaucracies and so on. That's always how the world is. But the question is, have we awoken a sufficient number of lateral thinkers, warrior types? Have we gotten those people talking to each other so that they can share ideas and increase their own power? I think the answer to that is yes. There's a wonderful community that's distilled all around the world of critical thinkers with incredible lateral thinking ability who see the world clearly and who help each other peel the scales from their eyes, when it comes to the other narratives that they might have bought into. So I think it's a particularly exciting time to be alive.
Yeah, I like it. Do you think that the next gambit, canard, or trick might relate to climate change? Is that your sense? Or the food crisis, the attacks on agriculture, the breaking down of the farming industry, the centralization of food production? Do you think this is what's being...
Chris Martenson was on the PBS NewsHour and promoted as a guy on the PBS NewsHour in 2008 already as a retired pharmaceutical executive going to live on his own. Chris Martenson was also in the Signal chat that Brett Weinstein was in with me in 2021 and also ignored the biology and virology that I established as probably fact while they were still in the Signal chat with me. So Chris Martenson, although I don't have any particular bones to pick with him because he's basically stayed out of my way and ignored me, he was in that Signal chat. He knows exactly what happened between Brett Weinstein and I. He knows exactly what happened between Alexandros Marinos and I, and he knows exactly when that went south and why it went south. And so I appreciate that he hasn't bothered to create any friction between me and myself, but I think it's because Chris Martenson was also put in place a while ago, wittingly or unwittingly, is participating in this now. And his early COVID coverage on YouTube is not gone, and his early COVID coverage is also worst case scenario. By far and away, it is worst case scenario. So again, he's probably allowed to tell the truth about peak oil and energy resources and fractional reserve banking as long as he doesn't tell the truth about a dangerous novel virus that millions people were killed from, millions more were saved from, and was likely gain of function, which is he still believes.
Teed up.
Very much so. And the parallels are stark. I mean, what have you got? You've got these models. What do the models predict? They predict climate change in the far future based on one parameter, CO2 concentration. Okay. By the way, the IPCC and all of the modelers there, they don't think that those changes are sufficient to produce climate change and climate crisis in the here and now. But that doesn't matter because the media are going to pretend that they do. And they're going to tell you that every time there's hot weather somewhere or a freak storm or whatever, that's climate crisis. And yeah, it seems to be very much the case that this is the Malthusian tonic of the current moment, the thing that's being used to stop African countries from expanding their power grids. So here in South Africa, we've been knocked off the project for decades now of building a nuclear power plant, which is the thing that would unlock the potential of this country.
That is something I'm sure they did not want him to say, that energy and development is being controlled around the world, and some countries are allowed to cut all their forests down and pollute all their water and burn all their trees and burn all their coal and build nuclear, and other countries are not. Other countries should still live the traditional way.
We are not allowed to do it. We have to go and borrow 2 trillion rand, which is an enormous amount of money for our economy, and invest it in what? Solar farms and wind farms, which will never solve the problem, never provide baseload. So this is the kind of the story that it leads to: complete degrowth, constraints on growth that they become shackles. And I think it's just horrible to do this to countries that have not yet developed all over the African continent. These are my favorite places, the places that I visit. I'm a tree hugger. I love the wilds. I get out into the wilds as often as I can, and I know them well. I study them. I'm down in the dirt and up the trees and in the forest all the time. So I'm really partial to ideas like biodiversity and conservation of habitats and so on. That's my stuff. But the conflation of that stuff with this whole energy conservation and net zero and the need to reduce carbon and decarbonize. No, I'm sorry, they're 2 totally different subjects. The one is a legitimate concern that any sensible person should have, and the other one is the domain of crazy people, and there are a lot of crazy people, and they're doing untold economic damage at the moment.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Well, it's not brilliant, it's terrifying, but thank you, Nick Hudson, for articulating it so beautifully and including a love of nature, participation in nature, acknowledgement of our integral relationship with nature as part of this conversation, but to observe too how whenever these arguments are mobilized, it is always to the disadvantage of the majority of people. It always legitimizes further centralization of authority. It always legitimizes censorship. It always legitimizes the condemnation of dissent. It's astonishing. I want to thank Thought Criminal for the assets that we were using there. Thank you for posting that. You're a great awakened wonder and contributor. Thank you for all of you for joining us for this conversation. And thank you, Nick Hudson, for joining us today on Stay Free with Russell Brand. I found that enjoyable. It's not often that I speak with someone and think, oh, yeah, no, this guy's, he's further into the edgelands than I thought I'd be willing to venture. Thanks for undertaking that journey with me.
Thank you, Russell.
Thank you, Nick Hudson. You can learn more about Nick Hudson's work by following the links to his organisation, Panda, and also by following him on Substack. There's a link in the description to that right now. You've got to join us next week for our conversation with Tulsi Gabbard. It's if you want to be part of that conversation.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much for joining me. We are still trying to dispel the faith in a novel virus. We've been in this car for a long time with these people. And we've got to get out of the car. We got to get our kids out of the car. We've got to teach them how the pandemic was created over a couple decades by a consistent pattern of telling us stories. Those stories can be broken, but we've got to teach biology to our children. And the hypothesis that we continue to operate under is that they did declare a pandemic, but there wasn't one. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been Gigaohm Biological, a high-resistance, low-noise information brief brought to you by a biologist. If you liked what you saw, please share it with those people that you love. And if you liked what you saw and you feel motivated to support it, please go to gigaohmbiological.com and find a way to buy us a coffee or that kind of thing. Because unlike the Vaccine Safety Research Foundation or Children's Health Defense or any of these other nonprofits that can take tax-deductible donations from other foundations and other weaponized piles of money, this is actually a news stream funded only by peasants like you, funding a peasant like me. I rent my house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and we live month to month here, so if you can help support this work, it would be really great. And I will definitely see you tomorrow at 10:10. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Love you very much. See you tomorrow.